Hello, everybody, and welcome to my podcast. I'm Melanie Escobar, and today I will be talking to you about the Sino-Japanese War. If you would like to listen to more of my podcasts, don't bother because this is the only podcast I've ever made. So let's get our history on. So, the Sino-Japanese War lasted from 1894 to 1895. And the start of the war was because of a conflict between China and Japan over territory. But for Japan, it was also to show global power around the world. However, there was many conflicts that occurred before the war that will lead up to it. For some background information, in the 19th century, China lost in the Opium War, which resulted in European Asia, which is why some parts of Europe will be mentioned during this. As well, since the Industrial Revolution, China had been relative to industrializing nations, so it wasn't really like a new thing. However, Japan had westernized, which basically means that they had a really good military and defense weapons. The main territory that Japan and China wanted over was Korea. Japan had been expanding for the last couple of years, making their mark on the world, but they wanted to expand into Korea. The reason for this is because Korea had been China's client in providing goods for them. However, Japanese islands saw natural resources of coal and iron, and Japan wanted to work with Korea to receive those same goods. Now, because Korea was working with China, there was no way Japan would be able to claim them as their own. So what Japan did was in 1875, they began to adapt to Western technology. And what this did was it essentially forced Korea to open up foreign trade. This happened because in 1875, they forced Korea to sign the Treaty of Ganghwa, which would open up their ports to Japan and essentially end the connections between Korea and China. As bad as it seems, it was a pretty good idea for Japan. This resulted in making Korea an independent nation. One of the specific events that triggered the conflict between China and Japan was Korea's inability from debilitating in fighting with the ruling dynasty. China and Japan both sent troops to restore order in Korea. However, the difference was that China went because Korea had requested, and Japan went out of Korea's objections. So, as you can see, Japan was a very demanding nation. Now, keep in mind that the war has not begun yet, and only conflicts between the nations have risen. Afterwards, before 1894, Japan and China both signed a treaty stating that neither would interfere with Korea any longer. However, in 1894, a Japanese Korean rebel was lured to Shanghai and executed there. This made Japan extremely angry and saw this as a breach in the treaty. Japan sent troops to China, and this was the start of the Sino-Japanese War. China and Japan began to prepare to go to war. However, Japan was way more advanced in this war than China due to quicker modernization with technology and weapons. An important date and event that occurred during this war was the Port Arthur Massacre of 1894. Port Arthur was a Chinese city, known today as Lushankou. This event is important because the Japanese went to the port and found Japanese soldiers strung up outside the city, mutilated and dead. Because of this horrendous event, the Japanese acted in a brutal manner towards the Chinese. Between November 21st and the 23rd of 1894, the Japanese killed from 1,000 to 20,000 Chinese soldiers and civilians. Some people say that this was a brutal massacre, and some say that it never happened, which is really weird. By March of 1895, Japan had taken over Korea, Shandong, and the Manchuria provinces of China. China was not succeeding in this war, and they could tell. Because of this, by April of 1895, China had called for peace. The treaty that ended the war was the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Chinese diplomats signed the treaty that ending the war on April 17, 1895. However, there were some terms to follow with this treaty. China handed over Taiwan and the Pescador Islands, as well as Lisin, Liaodong provinces, all to Japan. The treaty also made Korea an independent nation again. China also agreed to open up ports for Japan and gave them favored nation status. All seemed over with the war when this occurred. However, after this treaty was signed, many of the Western nations did not like the amount of power Japan had in the world. Russia, Germany, and France pressured Japan to return the Liaodong provinces to China. It wasn't a major change to what Japan had control over, but it was more than they expected to happen. Japan agreed that they did not have the power to take on all three of these provinces and return Liaodong back to China. The overall outcome of this war was that Japan was victorious in defeating China over territory and was able to take Korea, Shandong, and the Manchuria provinces. This was notorious for Japan because they had far less troops than China had, but Japan had more advanced weapons and military, which is what made them successful. Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. I hope you all enjoyed learning about the Sino-Japanese War. Stay tuned for next week when we talk about how 2020 is making history.